the Incubator, but is also a member of the Regulatory Horizons Council, which advises government, and also the director of the new Centre for Excellence for Regulatory Science and Innovation for AI and Digital Healthcare, also known as CERSI-AI. And today, rather than thinking so much about what we as developers or adopters are required to do by regulations, Alastair will be helping us think more about what the rest of the community requires of regulators and regulations. So thanks very much indeed for joining us and making time for the presentation, Alastair. I'll hand over to you at that and invite you to share screen. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here. Let me just try and share. And I'm hoping that's now in full screen mode.
That looks great.
Great. Yeah, so I'm Alastair. I don't think need any to kind of say anything further about me. Jeff, thanks very much. I want to start by just outlining the kind of three areas that I intend to sort of cover in more as a sort of opening into discussion points, really, rather than giving you answers, definitive answers to all of these things. The role of regulation, the role of science, particularly within regulation, and then kind of, well, how far does science take us, and when is it more of an art or something beyond science? So I want to start by asking you a question. Which would you rather have? A car with no engine or a car with no brakes? Fortunately, we don't usually have to make that kind of false dichotomy, that choice. Personally, I'd like a car with a good engine, reasonably fast, cost efficient, and reliable. But I'd also like to have really good brakes, an airbag, and have passed an MOT fairly recently. So I might be interested in how fast it gets 0 to 60, but I'd be just as interested as how fast it gets from 60 to 0. But sometimes when we talk about innovation and regulation, they're kind of held up as a sort of, again, a false dichotomy, opposed to each other. We think about innovation driving us forward, and all too often I think we can think of regulation as holding us back, kind of like not so much a brake as a sort of perpetual friction on the whole system. But in fact, if we want to go forward, we need both in balance. But it is worth recognizing, I think, that innovation and change generally is risky. But also staying still is risky and can be riskier. A lack of innovation can be just as much a patient safety issue as a lack of regulation. If we want tomorrow's diagnostics, treatments, and healthcare to be better than today, we do need to innovate, and we need to accept that that always comes with some degree of risk. But if at the same time we're going to be responsible and protect individuals and society from harm, then we also need to manage and reduce that risk appropriately. So in essence, the question of innovation, including the innovation of AI health technologies, becomes not just how fast can we get there, but also is there where we want to get to? And did we survive the journey? And the question for regulation, including the regulation of AI health technologies, is not just might we crash, but also are our control systems sufficient and efficient? And I'll come back to those two words recurrently through this talk. So we want to know, are they sufficient to reliably and predictably prevent bad stuff happening, whether that's crashing a car or crashing a national screening service? And are they efficient enough to enable us to benefit as soon as possible from good stuff, innovation, whether that's improving our car journey or our health journey? And I think it's worth realizing that actually, when it comes to it, innovators and regulators, they might look at the world through somewhat different lenses, And if we just go back, it's interesting that sometimes, and innovators, when we're sitting in the innovator frame, we just see the opportunity. We see that road open ahead of us. It all looks clear, and we can't see why anybody is asking for kind of challenging us or asking for extra evidence or all these kind of hoops we have to jump through, because we can see that opportunity ahead and we just want to get there as fast as possible and want to make a difference, make an impact, start having, return from the market and so on. And yet exactly the same situation when I'm sitting with a regulator's hat on might look really quite dangerous. So there's, the road's not clear. There's a lot happening around me. Are we sure, are we even going the right direction? And it's just worth recognizing that these are partly different lenses looking at the same thing. They're kind of trying to meet different needs, but ultimately, actually, they come together and we want the same thing from innovation and regulation. There needs to be that intersect, because long-lasting, sustainable, beneficial innovation depends on products being safe, of good value. They ultimately need to be good products and services coming to the market, and we need a system that rejects bad products and services. So that's kind of the sufficient bit, is do we have a regulatory system that is sufficient to do that, to enable good products to come through and to reject bad products or dangerous products and services? But we also need it to be efficient. So we can look at what efficiency means in the context of a regulatory system, but generally it's considered that it needs to be proportionate. So your regulation of a cytotoxic for chemotherapy might be different to, say, your regulation of a topical cream. And similarly, in the world of AI, not every AI health technology is the same. We need the regulatory systems to be fast. The time is not just money, but is actually existential to small businesses starting out, innovators creating new technologies. And it's worth recognizing, again, just as we think about these different lenses that innovators and regulators may look through, because they have kind of different drivers and different responsibilities. It's easier for us sitting on the regulatory side or the safety side to say, oh, we just need more time. We just need a bit more evidence. We just need this. We just need that. And yet, if I've got a critical, I've got a product trying to get through to market in order to get my first returns, that could be existential to my business. And that's a loss for me, it's a loss for the business, but it's also a loss to patients and the health service in terms of that opportunity. We also need the regulatory systems to be aligned. And what I mean by that is aligned both within your country, so trying to reduce redundancy across the system, but also globally. So regulation is time consuming, it's expensive, and the more aligned we are to kind of global regulatory systems, the better it is for companies and being able to move products in and out, which again is good for the manufacturers and the innovators, and is good for patients and the public to benefit from that. And with the rapidly moving technologies such as AI, we also need to recognize that existing regulatory systems may not always be optimized. In fact, they won't be optimized or even designed to address the specifics of these technologies. So we need some degree of adaptability of those, and not just a willingness to adapt, but to be able to do that rapidly and be responsive. So this is not just how quickly can you get a response to your kind of regulatory application, but is how quickly can the system adjust so as to be sufficient and efficient for evaluating my particular technology. Now, I realize I haven't really said what regulation is, and there's lots of different sort of definitions out there covering, because we can regulate all sorts of products and services. But in broad terms, and this is a definition from a report in 2023, but regulation is a set of rules, standards, and guidance, and traditionally that enforcement that government imposes to reduce public risk from business and other activities. And another definition from the Institute for Government is more broadly defined. Regulations, the use of rules, incentives, and penalties to change the behavior of individuals and organizations. While rules may be set out in law, this is not always the case. Regulation involves not only setting standards, but monitoring performance against them and enforcing compliance. Now, interestingly, there is a school of thought that feels that we spend too much time trying to set rules like sort of tram lines and then beating people over the head when they kind of deviate from them, and that the stick approach is ultimately unhelpful. But a lot of our regulatory system is still built on that basis. There is another approach to regulation, which is a bit more kind of collaborative and around outcomes based. So where you kind of agree or kind of the outcomes you're trying to get to as a kind of multi-stakeholder a group at the beginning. So that's regulators, innovators, wider public, etc. Anybody who's got a stake in the regulatory system agree the outcomes, and then that is effectively how you measure against. But traditionally, really globally, the kind of traditional regulatory system is around setting the rules and then monitoring compliance with those rules and enforcing compliance or punishing when people deviate from them. So it's a kind of negative corrective approach as opposed to a positive corrective approach. It is worth just pausing again, just this difference between rules, standards, and guidance. Rules, particularly in the context of medical devices, including AI health technologies, is kind of legally grounded. There's maybe a kind of primary act of law, and then this is effectively sit within what's sometimes called secondary legislation, which points to saying what the kind of the rules that the devices have to comply with. But they tend to be fairly principle based. And then standards is a kind of more detailed, bit more of a checklist against which you can check that you've complied with those rules. And if they're harmonized standards, then it's kind of recognized. It's almost like there's an official link between that and the original legislation. So you can say, oh, I've complied with the standards, and therefore you can be reasonably confident that if you really have, that you're within the law. But there's also a this kind of softer approach below standard, which are alongside standards, called guidance, which can be, again, really helpful. They don't have to carry the same weight, but can still be really useful for innovators, manufacturers in this space. But what I wanted just to draw your attention to is essentially regulation is around trying to make things happen that wouldn't happen without you doing it. So in fact, if we were all uber responsible and doing all the right things anyway, we wouldn't need regulation. It's worth just bearing in mind where, if we're thinking about what good regulation looks like for AI health technologies, it's not thinking about we need to describe every single thing to define this space that we need to operate in, but we do need to define those spaces without which people might operate outside of what we believe to be good. And we'll talk a little bit about what good looks like as we go forward. So what's the role of science in this space? So having touched a bit on regulation. Well, I would say that it's around moving from, I feel that this is a good product, to I know that this is a good product, or I have evidence that this is likely to be a good product, and this is how confident, this is some estimate of how confident we can be based on this evidence so far. It's a bit like going from the sort of narrative-based policy, which is often, I've had this great idea, or I've got this vision for something which would be so much better than we have today, to actually evidence-based policy, which is I have this good idea, and this is why I can demonstrate to you that it is worth pushing ahead and making this change or innovating in this way. So we're looking for evidence, and we're using science and sort of scientific methodology in quite a broad sense here, but using different forms of evidence to establish both where the technologies are doing what we want to, but also is the regulatory system itself doing what we want it to do. Now, it's interesting. We're used, on the kind of, and expect that the innovators and manufacturers provide evidence to us that their products are doing everything that we ask of it. But we don't often turn the lens the other way and ask the regulators to demonstrate the evidence that their regulatory system is sufficient and efficient for the purpose, sort of fit for purpose. And here, when we talk about regulation in terms of medical devices, people would naturally think of particularly maybe the MHRA and maybe NICE. I recognize they have somewhat different role as an health technology assessor and looking at value. You might look at, Health Research Authority, regulating the research that's done in these technologies. You might think about the Care and Quality Commission. This is all in a kind of particularly in a kind of UK focused, and some of that is more kind of England focused. I recognize that. But these are the different levels of types of regulation you might have within your health system if you're, anywhere in the world, if you covering different aspects of the kind of products and services in this space. But it's reasonable to expect those regulatory systems to be doing what we need them to do. But it's also, I would point out, it's not just those that are regulators in name, but it's actually the wider ecosystem as a whole. So if you're kind of working within the NHS, you also are a gatekeeper to some extent in just the way that you might be involved in procuring technologies. That's a gatekeeping role. You might be involved in decisions as to whether you deploy it within your service. And you might be an individual clinician, health professional of any type that has a choice as to when you use these technologies. So all of these are gatekeeper roles, and we need to ensure that we are making those decisions appropriately. And this is where an evidence-based or sort of scientific thinking rather than a kind of emotional response is really important. So regulatory science is a thing. It's kind of the application of scientific methodology to the regulatory system. And I'll just touch on a few different ways it can be of value. So it can help in terms of evaluating the existing system. Sufficiency and efficiency. So sufficiency, essentially doing that job that I talked about weeding out good products from bad products. And there's an iterative loop here. If we think about the arrow of innovation moving left to right, the regulatory system has a gatekeeping role within that, and it also helps not just sort of enforce compliance when you drift off target, but actually helps make an agreement about where good sits and what you are aiming for. But we know the regulatory system is not perfect. So again, a sort of scientific methodology applied to that regulatory system enables it to iteratively improve and ensure that it's optimized for the current technologies coming through. And we've talked about it earlier being proportionate, fast, responsive, aligned, and adaptable. But the thing is that technologies don't stay the same, do they? So we need to think about how that system works today. And here I've just highlighted multiple sort of gatekeepers along the way, and the fact that we need sequential levels of evidence. So I'm just going to quickly just take a detour just to talk about some of the later steps here. So one of the things that's been interesting recently is that a number of AI health technologies have come through to they come through, they have market approval from MHRA, they're on the market, and then they've come to NICE for early value assessments. And a recurrent, I put that question to how much evidence is needed, and a recurrent refrain is more research is needed. And specifically, if we look, there was a list of products from that EVA, and one of the things they highlighted was that they needed ongoing evaluation, kind of in situ, and together ongoing evidence of value. So this was not, they'd already had their pre-market assessment, but there was ongoing need for more evidence. So there were things like how using the software affects healthcare costs and resource use, impact on review and reporting time, technical failure and rejection rates of software, whether software works in groups that could particularly benefit. So these are kind of new challenges that we don't normally, when we think about the kind of accumulation of evidence for a product coming to market, I think it's fair to say that we're not used to seeing these kind of challenges coming back at the point that it comes to NICE. And this is partly because these technologies don't sit so comfortably within our traditional regulatory pipelines. There is a recognition that these technologies, it's hard to predict exactly what their value is going to be in the mainstream business as usual. And so often when it comes to NICE, there is this request for more evidence, and it's something, again, we need to think about. Is this a problem that sits with innovators, that kind of as innovators and manufacturers, we need to be just alive to this and generate all this kind of in pathway evidence earlier? Is this a challenge for the regulatory system, that we could maybe pull that kind of pre-market, post-market barrier forward and bring technologies through in a kind of a probationary way and enable them to gather their evidence in situ in a way that is works both for the manufacturers and for the health service and is safe for patients. So this brings us to kind of innovating the system. We've talked about evaluating the regulatory system, but how can we innovate it to meet the needs and opportunities of the newer technologies? That also brings us to horizon scanning and trying to spot these technologies before they come to market and be ready for them, so that we're kind of not worrying about how we assess as a regulator for algorithmic bias once we have these types of technologies in front of us, but actually have put some thought into it and probably working with the manufacturers ahead of time, even in development. So there's horizon scanning, mapping the regulatory implications of new technologies. There's also a role for those of us working in this space to actually design regulatory innovations. So regulators, extremely busy, extremely stretched services, and they're facing the immediate. There is scope for kind of regulatory people working in this space, often in academia, to kind of look at the kind of further horizon and go, okay, we've got an opportunity here. What can we learn? What we can learn from other jurisdictions, or in the context of AI, what can we learn from other sectors even? Looking at what's happening with autonomous vehicles elsewhere, where can we bring those lessons on autonomy back into the health space? And then what's the gap? So what can't we borrow or learn from elsewhere, but we have to invent here? Just because we regulate drugs one way, or kind of more basic medical devices one way, doesn't mean that we necessarily have to regulate this new technology that way. And in this basket, the kind of generative AI, and particularly large language models, is in exactly that kind of technology where there's this debate: is this a kind of extension or an evolution of existing ways of regulation, or does this require serious innovation and a kind of revolution of how we think about regulating this kind of technology? The other thing that often happens in the kind of regulatory science space is because sits within academia is the ability to convene and being hopefully a safe space that inclusively and equitably we can bring all sectors together, including industry and regulators, which can sometimes be a slightly uh, uh, it's sort of challenging environment to have kind of frank and open conversation and bringing people around the table together. I think it's in our experience has been incredibly powerful, and everybody gains, and we kind of move things forward much faster. And then there's also an education role. I sit between the NHS and a university, and so a big part of our role is also to educate, to share knowledge, and to learn as well, and to bring the wider community, support the wider community like that. I mentioned earlier about alignment, and again, one of the key things here, and I have to say that MHRA have been brilliant at this, working with Health Canada and the FDA, is to as they looked at the challenge of AI health technologies, to really seek out opportunities to work together to avoid redundant effort. We're all tackling the same problems, and then by bringing together these higher principles and saying, yeah, this is what good looks like, this is what we want manufacturers to be building towards, then that can still be contextualized into your local, into your country, into your local jurisdiction. So again, this is a space that regulatory science, also the scientific community supporting the regulators, work internationally to try and say, okay, you've said that you require testing demonstrates device performance during clinically relevant conditions. What does that actually look like? How do we know when we've tested enough? What are the levels of evidence that provides sufficient confidence for this to get regulatory approval? Is this different in different jurisdictions? And if so, why? So these are the sorts of questions, if the kind of the high level principles are set as to what good looks like, which may be beyond the scientific role, what is the kind of the actual detail that sits underneath that? So we've been talking about regulatory science for quite a long time, but actually this is well established in some parts of the world, including particularly the US, who had set up centers of excellence for regulatory science and innovation. But the UK has never invested in regulatory science. So people work in this space, academics, and trying to tackle these kind of the scientific and evidence-based problems of regulation and do all these things, but it's never had specific funding. But actually, over the last 12 months, there has been significant funding put into building 7 centers of excellence for regulatory science and innovation, looking at different areas of healthcare. And in fact, there's 2 that are particularly interested in AI as a medical device. One that I'm going to talk to you about today called CERSI-AI, and I know that one best. And there's another CERSI called Radiant, led out of Brunel, which we're working with very closely. But today I'm going to talk more about the kind of regulatory science that we're focused on within CERSI. So CERSI-AI is a new national centre of excellence working with innovators, regulators, research, patient, and NHS. And our aim is to optimize the regulation of AI and digital health technologies to accelerate innovation that will improve people's lives. And our overall vision, which is obviously a bit repetitive, but also to make the UK a global leader in the regulation of AI and digital healthcare. And we want, to make this the best place for innovators to develop, evaluate, and market new products and services, and the best place for patients and health staff to benefit from AI and digitally enabled healthcare. And there's kind of 3 kind of pillars of work: research, which we've sort of been talking about the sorts of things we might be interested in, education, and policy. And just in this, it's worth noting that education, actually the Incubator, which obviously we're part of our Incubator webinar right now, is it holds the sort of knowledge transfer role for CERSI, and policy also links to the AI and digital regulators regulation service of the four major regulators. Builds on established roles and partnerships with regulators, and builds on a massive and very exciting network of partners and collaborators. The partners from CERSI include University of Birmingham, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, University of York, ABHI, Newton's Tree, University Hospitals Birmingham, Hardian Health, and Bromley Life Sciences. So 6 practical outputs we expect from year 1 is Harry, the regulatory intelligence database for medical devices, and we'll there's been a lot of interest in this, so we'll ask Joe to present. On a future occasion, we've had borderline manual, working on a borderline manual for software medical device and AI's medical device. That's essentially the kind of guide to when you've got a device that kind of, which way does it sit? Is this a medical device or is this not a medical device? And then we're looking at qualification and risk classification of large language models in healthcare. Lots of work on post-market surveillance. What does good look like in this space? Algorithmic bias, obviously that's a really hot topic, but we're particularly focused on what do regulators need to know effectively, how to detect and mitigate from a regulatory standpoint. And then what are the opportunities for recognition and reliance for AI's medical device? That's essentially what can we borrow from other regulatory evaluations around the world and just go and lift and drop that and say, yeah, that's okay, this product can come in, or this is the delta, this is what the extra evidence we need before we can say that this model approved in the US is acceptable in the UK. So we launched a Global AI Conference in February and got support from the Royal College of Radiologists, amongst others, for this, which is exciting. And essentially, I just put this up in terms of recent activities to give you a bit of a flavor of the kind of work we're doing. So I put up 6 kind of particular targets for the CERSI for the first year, but we're also just trying to support regulators and the wider ecosystem in this space where we can offer value around bringing that scientific methodology and an understanding of the kind of both the principles and practice of regulation in this challenging space. So that might range from work in mental health, even procurement, because that's another gatekeeping step, which actually does form part of that overall regulatory and safety ecosystem. Synthetic data, when can that support regulatory decisions? Practical considerations for AI implementation screening, and also the use of secure data environments for AI innovation. So just one last thing on CERSI-AI that I want to point out is that the website is currently, there's a sort of beta website that's available, and you can see the link there. But when the main website comes online, one of the things we want that to be is just like your kind of go-to site for policy in this space, both obviously we're based in the UK, so there'd be right focus on that, but also global policy, and to be a trusted source for that kind of information, which, if you're like me, you often just get from LinkedIn and then chase down to the original sources, but to try and bring that all together in one space. But lastly, is come into land. Just a few moments to think, okay, so we've talked about some of those regulatory principles. We talked about the kind of how the scientific methodology can help us unpack some of the kind of the ways that with our products and services work, but also the regulatory system itself works and so on. But I think we have a problem because science kind of only takes us so far. And I think the issue is that our AI ambition is a combination, or a kind of AI imagination of whether what we think about AI health technologies is a combination of our imagination, interpolation, and desperation. If I can just unpack that for you for a moment. So we imagine, so unlike most health technologies, we grow up with this kind of concept of AI. just from childhood stories, etc. And some people will have a very positive view from their imagination and excited and looking forward to it. And some people have a very negative view of kind of Skynet and so on and fearful. There's also, so that's already means that there's a strong emotional response. We also have interpolation where we we have AI in our pockets. We see it doing one thing in a kind of consumer space, and we go, "Oh, it can manage my Spotify account actually pretty well." And so, it's that sophisticated. Why don't we just bring it into kind of managing our waiting list? And then desperation, which is that, again, for those of us who work in healthcare, it's like current solutions just don't work anymore, in the sense that we kind of, the capacity demand mismatch is growing exponentially, and we can't just do more of the same. So we're looking for magic solutions. So that's a dangerous sort of cocktail that can overlay. We've just been talking about evidence, bringing science, but actually this means that when we look at kind of the opportunity and the potential for AI, whether specific products or even the kind of as a class, we can make bad decisions. And these have consequences. So it might be bad investment. So people are so excited, they just stick AI on every potential product. And, we're having serious investment, whether from funders or, government funders or venture capitalists, going to things that are just not helpful or dangerous. Some of those, maybe they do come through, and we have citizen harm, or at least risk of citizen harm. And then that in turn can lead to lost confidence. So there's I talk about the science, but there's risk around the kind of emotional response we have, more than perhaps any other health technology. So it's just worth bearing that in mind when we come back to the regulation. So we need a regulatory system that is measured, science-based, not narrative-based, but science and evidence-based. And we, as gatekeepers, wherever we sit in that system, whether you're a regulator or whether you're actually somewhere else in that system, need to remember that we also actually have quite an emotional response, whether of fear or of enthusiasm, when we're making these decisions. So we don't need to choose necessarily between a car with no engine or a car with no brakes. We kind of need both working together. But again, I just put this to say that kind of in the same technology can feel very different where you sit in the system and what your kind of emotional overlay is. But also the regulatory system itself can feel very different, whether you're a regulator going, "Well, this all looks like it's working smoothly to me," or you're an innovator which is going, "Wow, how many road bumps are there that I need to get through? How slow is this? How much traffic is there? How much friction in the system?" And it's worth, again, just having those conversations, working how can we bring this all together to make a system that is both sufficient and efficient. But one last thought for you before we come to questions is, again, science could help us assess whether products meet the bar. Science can help us assess whether the regulatory system meets the bar we set for it. But actually defining where the bar should sit, or defining where we're trying to get to, is not something that we can kind of mathematically calculate. This comes down to values. It comes down to what we think is appropriate in terms of risk, certainty, what level of harm is potential harm is acceptable. And these are really difficult decisions. So we can use, again, methodologies to try and reach answers to those, including consensus methodology, but ultimately those are tricky decisions which we can't find in an equation or an algorithm. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much indeed for that. So very helpful kind of synopsis of what's the same and what's different, thinking through those principles and how AI brings certain distinctions. So please do bring some questions into the Q&A bit, but at the bottom, type away. But just whilst we're getting going, I've just struck by the kind of dichotomy you pose with regulation of sort of hitting people over the head with a stick, the negative framing, and then the kind of potential for a carrot and the positive framing. And with the current system, do you think there are any kind of obvious or key opportunities to frame the regulatory system more as a kind of scaffold for innovators rather than that kind of barrier or thing to comply with?
Yeah, so uh I mean I sometimes talk about trying to think of regulation as exactly that, a scaffold for innovation and not a straitjacket. Um so I think it definitely does have that role, but if we're going to I think that role would be more convincing perhaps if we were also then able to make it as efficient and as fast as possible. So if we think, for example, about those kind of areas that where where people are just looking at what risk class a product should be, I don't think I think it has to be, if we're honest about it, when people are looking at their technology and they look at the risk classes, they don't think, what's the best technology? What's the most useful thing I can make? And then assess what the risk class is, and then address it accordingly in a completely neutral way. I think it can happen the other way around, which is what's the lowest barrier that actually I can manage given my limited resource and challenge and timelines. And then, in a sense, we innovate to that level. And so there's something around using regulation to show what good looks like, but also making sure that that kind of innovation pipeline is meets it in a way that is sustainable, manageable for businesses and sustainable for businesses. Then that includes clarity, rapid response, no redundant effort. It's just that just killed small companies.
Thanks very much. So I'll bring in some of the questions from the floor now. I'll do that with unmuting, hopefully. So
Mm.
we've got a question from Mazen Ahmed. Mazen, hopefully you'll find yourself able to talk. I think I've just unmuted.
Yeah, hi, hello, I'm here.
Hi, Mazen.
Hi. Oh, do I say my question? Okay.
Yeah, over to you for your question. Thanks very much.
Do you see a future where AI technology serve as a sufficient and efficient regulator for a network of AI systems that are interconnected and interdependent via their data outputs, with each AI node managing its own specific system per se?
Wow, I love that. So I don't. It's interesting. So this is where I have an emotional response rather than a logical response. I think my logical response is probably, yeah, I mean, kind of why not? Um, Certainly if we mean by a regulatory system to sort of safety monitoring, etc. My emotional response is I still want a human in the loop somewhere. Now, the human in the loop doesn't have to be prior to action. The human in the loop can be kind of an more distant oversight, and it can be a retrospective one. It could be a kind of auditing a certain percentage. Is the overall system still working as we want it to do, and so on. But I mean, I think that it feels just a very foreign way of looking at it now, Mazin. But I think it's a fair question to be asking, and I don't think we can rule it out.
Thank
I
you.
just within, I mean, there's also what is possible, and then what is acceptable within the current legal framework. And so, but this is a future state, so this is a horizon scanning. So yeah, thanks, Mazin.
Thanks very much. And then we've got a next question from Shazwath Ganapathy, who I've just unmuted, I hope.
Yeah,
Thank you very
thanks,
much.
Jeff.
Over to you.
I was quite interested when you were talking about how traditional systems use a negative corrective approach. I was wondering if you've got any examples of good good examples which are using a positive corrective approach?
Yeah, so thanks. So the person who talks about outcome-based cooperative regulation particularly is somebody there's a kind of school of thought around this, and one of my colleagues, Professor Chris Hodges, does a lot of work in this space. He's the chair of something called the Regulatory Horizons Council, and advises the UK government in this space, and is very much an advocate of that. We should move from this kind of negative enforcement type approach to a kind of cooperative approach. There's some examples, not in the healthcare space that I know of in terms of healthcare regulation, but there are examples in other sectors where they've looked at this more seriously. But I'm afraid I'm not an expert. What I would say is, coming back to healthcare, what's interesting is it really reflects a tendency within how we do health generally, to try and bring stakeholders in to kind of define what we're trying to build as the health ecosystem. So, the traditional, if we think about it as well in terms of traditional medicine, it was kind of very much doctor knows best, and it's the kind of the way that has changed, and it's accepted that actually we're now trying to provide a service that the kind of whole ecosystem has to work and be centered around patients and patient outcomes, and outcomes that matter to patients and not what doctors think matter. It just seems to reflect exactly what this argument would be in the regulatory space as well. So Shazwa, I can't give you good examples within health where this is done, but it's certainly something I'm interested in seeing if it is more possible than we do today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we've had a couple of questions come in about this idea of sandboxes or AI airlock. I've just unmuted Alex Black. If I could hand over to you, Alex, for your question, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my question, ties in with one from someone else around whether there are any regulatory sandboxes or other similar initiatives currently available in the UK. And so my question was specifically about one of those, which is the current MHRA AI airlock, which I think has just gone into phase 2. And I wondered if you have oversight of what's happening in that airlock, what you anticipate will come out of it, and how that will feed into your work.
Yeah, so I think the AI airlock is a fantastic initiative. I don't sit on the governance of that. Some colleagues do. I think it's brilliant and is exactly what we should be doing more of. I think, incidentally, one of the interesting things is that I think AI, because there's so much attention on it, it kind of shines a light on the kind of wider area of medical devices and to some extent and innovative technologies. So I think some of the things that we're learning and innovating in the regulation of AI, we'll see kind of coming through in other parts of health sector, health technologies. So we may see other airlocks coming through. But I think it's exciting to see what will come through the airlock in terms of not just the individual technologies, but as you know, part of the point is for the MHRA and the wider system to understand what they need to do in order to make the regulatory system work more efficiently for these technologies. I think there is an opportunity to extend what the airlock does, and there's an opportunity for the wider community, including people who are interested enough to log in for this call, to potentially think about, what could airlock 3.0 look like? How can we make the regulatory system just much more adaptive? Alex, the only other thing I would say around this is that we sometimes, I think, particularly in the UK, like to pilot things and make special cases, and we make alternative routes for innovative devices, etc. Like kind of extra fast lanes because we see there's a problem within the existing system. And what always worries me is that actually, and I don't mean this about the airlock, but some of these initiatives effectively are kind of workarounds, and that what they really tell us is that the existing system either doesn't have the resource or isn't designed optimally, or it's just overall too slow. And therefore we're building these workarounds to kind of cover that gap. And so the only thing I would say is that as we're going forward, it's also what is there that we're discovering within the airlock that actually should be brought back into just business as usual for kind of the whole system.
Thank you very much. Next up, thanks, Alex. Next up, we've got a question thinking about the breadth of the AI regulatory system you touched on from Mani Hussain from the CQC. I think I've just unmuted you. Hopefully, there's sometimes a little bit of a lag. Let me try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Hi, Mani.
Hello. Hi. Mani Hussain, Director of Primary and Community Care Quality Commission. Some of you on this call would know that we're trying to be very active in this place, especially around facilitation with others, albeit we don't regulate medical devices such as the MHRA. We're a generalist regulator by which we're looking at the outcomes in terms of what providers provide their service users, whether it's in health and or social care. So my question really is, we're already on this journey trying to gather a kind of collective approach, but we're a kind of a generic regulator. Ultimately, when we go out to GP practices or hospitals, we're looking at the end result. So what kind of three main pieces of advice would you give to me as a regulator in terms of my must-dos to make sure that patients or service users or people ultimately aren't harmed by AI?
Well, Mani, let me give you a couple, and then but I'd love to give you a chance to respond because I'd love it'd be great to hear kind of your thoughts on this. And just on this generally, I would say, you know, I think we certainly don't have all the answers here. We're kind of all learning as we go along, and I think one of the roles that, particularly with this award of CERSI-AI, is to try and bring people together who are asking these questions and try and effectively match make teams to then find those answers. So for example, you may be asking these questions already, and that there's kind of within the CERSI network, you know, is there an opportunity for us to help if you need extra resource or people, other parts of the network to kind of join forces. So that's just a general invitation to anybody on the call, wherever you sit in the ecosystem. But Mani, I think the CQC has a really interesting and important role here. I think in a sense, my friends at the MHRA will hate me for saying this, but the MHRA have the easy job in the sense that they're primarily focusing on that device. You know, there's a thing, you know, it might be software. And I would say, well, no, we're also having to think about the human factors and the kind of how it performs with a human operating it. But still, ultimately, it's a relatively defined system. You're looking at the most extraordinary kind of end of the telescope, where this is working across interacting with multiple systems, multiple people, and a patient is at the center of that. And as you say, you're then looking at outcomes. So things I would look at, one is AI readiness, the kind of the ability of those organizations to be actually deploying. Are they not just before we get to outcomes, but before they deploy, procure, and implement technology, have they reached the state of readiness that you would expect from that they can then deploy that safely? And I think we're still trying to work out collectively what readiness looks like for different levels of AI technology. The other thing is, and well, as part of that is, do they have a system in place that when they've implemented, they can ensure that, or as part of implementation, that everybody is skilled up sufficiently that they know what they're doing, the kind of the human system, as it were, and alongside the kind of technological system, all the interactions, etc. Is it, you know, is there reasonable expectation that it's going to behave as intended within that complex system. And then during that implementation and ongoing as business as usual, you cannot assume that you can just play it out the box. It needs to have an ongoing algorithmic audit type approach or some regular quality assurance going on at the same time as now that's a manufacturer's duty as part of post-market surveillance, but I think it also sits with us on the NHS as care of our patients to ensure that before we procure and we sign those contracts, that we're really clear about where the responsibility is, who's collecting what data, how that's going to be acted on, if performance declines, who acts when, and to tie that all down in advance. And then I would expect it to be reasonable for the CQC perspective to be able to go to health institutions and ask for that kind of evidence of readiness, evidence, outcomes, of course, which you're collecting already, evidence of how they implement, and evidence of ongoing quality and safety as business as usual. But Manny, over to you. What's the answer?
Well, to be honest, we're doing quite a lot of work, and I think one of my clinical fellows, he's Ahmed, Dr. Taf Ahmed, he's leading on some work around primary care, which we started somewhere, and of course we're going to use that as a foundation to look at the sectors, whether they're health or social care. But absolutely, I think as a regulator, we've got to ask those very, very basic questions, in that if you are using something, do you understand its limitations? And if you understand its limitations, what steps are you taking to mitigate and control for those limitations? And then human oversight, I think, is absolutely key when you're dealing with people. And what form does that human oversight take? What training do people get? And what assurance can you give us that actually it's an ongoing quality control, quality assurance process that you're using on this? So, I mean, it's irrespective of whether it's AI technology or any technology, the questions are more or less the same. If you're using something, are you aware of its limitations, and what steps are you taking to mitigate harm due to its limitations, whether it's hallucinations or or whether actually you've not done your due diligence on the algorithmic bias that it might have. So there is a generous approach, and when we're out there in terms of readiness, we're looking at primary care at this moment in time, but that there is a lot of AI companies out there which are naturally asking GPs to use their products to improve efficiency, productivity, and what have you. So we've got a bit of catch up to do, but I think one of our roles is to issue clear guidance which signposts all the guidance out there, such that people who are using AI technology in their service look at the frameworks that they have to consider for their due diligence. So our job really is to point people in the right direction, and when we do inspect, clearly get assurance that indeed people are aware of the standards, whether ICB 160, for example, or if you're the kind of deployer, and they need to demonstrate that they've done their due diligence. So I hope that kind of gives you an inkling of what we kind of expect.
That's brilliant, Manny. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks very much for all of the questions and discussion that have come up. Unfortunately, we're running up beyond time, so we're not going to be able to get to them all here, but rest assured we'll take stock of them as we plan future webinar series. So thanks very much for the contribution. On that note of future sessions, I'll just flag that next time, Tuesday the 13th of May, we'll be joined by Dr. Angus Ramsey, who leads the NHR Rapid Service Evaluation team working on evaluating implementation experiences and impact of AI in NHS chest diagnostics, which came off back the AI Deployment Fund. So please do join us for that session too next month. But with that, just remains for me to say a big thank you to Alastair for joining us today for the talk. And thank you very much to everybody for dialing in. we hope to see you next time. Enjoy your evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.